It's really good to have you joining this session on Anxiety Unplugged. Many of you here will be well aware that we're seeing increased mental health problems and anxiety in our young people, and therefore we need to be able to help them uh, manage that, prevent it, and deal with it when it occurs. I'm going to start just by introducing myself. Um, I'm Dr. Linda DeCasticker. I'm a public health doctor. I'm part of the Care Visions team. And I think, as I said at our last event, I've had many different roles and jobs over my career, but the most satisfying, but also the most challenging, was being the mother of 4 children. I'm now a grandmother, and I have to say, so much less stressful and such fun. And it's worth being a parent just to be a grandparent. But yeah, I think we're all aware of that parenting role can be tough, but definitely worth all the effort. And we've got Sarah with us as well. Do you want to just introduce yourself, Sarah, before I introduce Alicia?
Sure, thanks, Linda. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah McInhill, so I'm part of the Care Visions team as well with the fostering team that we have here. And yeah, you know, anxiety is a huge issue, I guess, for many of the children and young people who we care for, and in terms of supporting them, the carers as well. And in my own experience as a parent, Linda, I've still got to get to that grandparent stage. So, and my children are younger, so we'll just see how things evolve for them. But it is such a key issue, isn't it, for all of our young people, and the pressures that are on them from different places and spaces, just wherever they as they navigate through life. So I think it's a real kind of key topic as a parent to hear more, and I'm really pleased to be part of this as well.
So I will now introduce you to Alicia Drummond, who's the founder of Teen Tips and the Wellbeing Hub. She was just telling us a bit about it before we opened up, and certainly it sounds fantastic, and a lot of great work has gone into that. But Alicia, do you want to just tell us a bit about yourself?
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me this evening. It's great to be with you all. A really important topic, so I'm looking forward to drilling into that a bit more. So I'm a mum as well, and I've got two girls. They are actually in their 20s now, and I'm rather hoping I might be a granny fairly soon. That hasn't happened yet, but no pressure. And I'm also a therapist by training. So I qualified in 2009. I was working with teenagers mostly in therapy. And at the school where my kids were at, they were like, "Oh, can you come and do a listening skills course for our pupils?" So I started off doing that and really loved it. And they kind of threw me in with 100 young people aged 13 to 18 and for 3 hours. And when I came out, I must have looked like a rabbit in the headlights. And the guy said, "Well, if you can do that, you can do anything." And then if you're working with young people, you kind of quickly work out that actually, if you could just tweak the environments around them, often they wouldn't end up in therapy to start off with. So I did a lot of training in parenting and created a parenting teens workshop, which we trialed, and there happened to be just purely by chance, and I was really glad I didn't know before, quite an eminent psychiatrist on the course who loved it. And so we did that, and then the courses grew and grew. And by 2018, I was working in 187 schools, and my car was like a mobile cafe bin. And I just thought this is not sustainable long term. So we started just putting some of the courses that we created. So there's one for parents or parenting teens course, one for school staff, and we started putting those online. And then, of course, COVID came around, and suddenly I wasn't going anywhere. And we had time to do what I'd always wanted to do, which I kind of always wished I'd had, was like a little safe space where people could come and get expert information when they needed it. So we created a hub for parents in the June, and then I was like, right, well, we'll do one for the staff because the pastoral load on staff in schools, it has just grown exponentially over the last 5 to 10 years. So we launched that in November, and then we're like, well, we're not really doing the job unless we've got all the different stakeholders. So we then created a platform for pupils, so 10 plus, 13 plus, 16 plus. And it's grown and grown. So we're now in over 300 schools here and abroad, and we support about 170,000 pupils, students, plus all of their parents, plus all of their staff. So it's a bit bonkers, but it's been quite the ride.
Yeah, fantastic. Alicia, we've heard a lot and we read a lot in the media that young people's mental health is getting worse, particularly anxiety, and that's been worse since the pandemic. Is that the case? And why is that?
I mean, if you look at the NHS digital reports and you compare 2017 with the last one that I was looking, which came out in November last year, so I imagine they're just about to release another one, there has very definitely been a shift from, I think it was 1 in 9 in 2017, and we're now sitting at 1 in 4 of the older age group, experiencing some form of mental health disorder. So the statistics, if you look at those, they will definitely tell you that we have had a shift. Now, whether some of that will be that young people are more willing to report and talk about what they're experiencing, but I don't think that explains the kind of level of shift that we've seen.
Yeah, and there was a colleague of mine, Elaine Lockhart, a consultant psychiatrist in The Guardian today, saying, people have to wait at least 2 years to be seen by child and adolescent psychiatric and mental health services. So are there things that as parents or as carers we can do to help a young person who's suffering from anxiety?
Absolutely. I mean, there's lots that we can do. And but I think perhaps, and it sounds, this is going to sound a bit weird, but first thing is that we have to see it.
Yeah.
And that's because when you think about, especially with children, they kind of, they kind of know that what they're experiencing is different, and there's an element of shame around it. So often they try and hide it, and it will come out as, well, I've got a tummy ache or I've got a headache. For the teenagers, it might be, I don't want to try that new activity. No, I can't do it. I can't do it. I don't want to do it. And that's because underneath that there is this anxiety. So I think the first thing is that we have to be able to see it for what it actually is. Um, and then I think there's an awful lot that we can do. Um, but you've got to kind of gauge the level. So is a child able to function in a normal environment like school? And if they're not able to function in a normal normal environment, you can then say, well, anxiety, if it's anxiety related, that has now become a chronic, stable difficulty, and we must do something because that child is suffering. Um, I don't know whether you want to go to kind of the treatment route or what parents could do, but I think you were talking about what parents
Yeah.
will do first and
Yeah.
foremost, weren't you? And I think the problem is that anxiety, you kind of have to look at both. So when we're treating anxiety, the kind of traditional route is cognitive behavioral therapy. Um, and sometimes medication, but cognitive behavioral therapy is the one that everybody talks about. There's some really new ones, interesting ones coming through. So things like VR, virtual reality, being used to help young people get over things like phobias. I can't think of a better way of getting over a phobia of flying than being able to put a VR mask on and gradually get used to being in a plane. But at the moment, that's not widespread. So CBT would be, cognitive behavioral therapy would be the first one. But over in the States, we've got two really amazing researchers, and Dr. Rachel Klein, who you might have heard of, who has really dedicated her whole life to exploring anxiety. And she and her protege, Dr. Daniel Pine, so Klein and Pine, which is always helpful. They've done a lot of research into what really works, and the CBT is really great, but it doesn't really work until we bring in some kind of exposure. So if you think about what anxiety is, it's the essence of anxiety is that kind of what if, what if, what will happen? It's anticipatory. So um, if we can help them to it, we do the cognitive bit to kind of adjust any wonky thinking. Yeah. But then we have to start to expose them. And the problem from a parent's perspective is that we spend our whole lives trying to help them avoid pain and difficulty. So actually it's very, very challenging to encourage a child to keep either, even if it's just staying stationary or moving forwards into a situation that they find difficult. So it's finding that sort of sweet spot really between kind of slightly pushing them out of their comfort zone, but not pushing them into the fear zone. Because if you push them into their fear zone, then we exacerbate the problem. And so yes, there's the clinical side of it, but as you pointed out, the waiting lists for CAMS are incredibly long, and actually the level of need is now so high. So in this area, I'm down in the south of England, and you won't get a CAMS appointment unless, probably you've had at least one unsuccessful suicide attempt or your BMI is below a certain level. It's a really high bar that you have to meet, which is really sad. So actually, the getting the treatment is hard, but I think with parents, it's that first of all, it's that empathy side of it. I can see you're really struggling right now.
Yeah.
Can I?
And
Sorry, but can I just come? I was
sorry,
just going to go
Sarah, you
back a
come in.
little bit. Yeah, sorry, Linda. Yeah, I think our signal dropped a little bit there. But no, I was going to go back a little bit because you mentioned like some of the pressures on young people as well. So going back to that kind of digital report, what are kind of some of the pressures that our young people are experiencing or sharing? Are there common themes across? And it's just to kind of before we get into that CBT and therapy and the kind of formal support, kind
Yeah.
of as a parent, how can we get in maybe a bit earlier to support our children?
Yeah, I think, it's kind of understanding that anxiety, it basically it's a very usually it isn't caused by one thing. It's usually a very complex kind of interplay of biological factors, of psychological factors, of sociocultural factors. And lots of those we can do something about, and some of them we can't. So we can't, for example, if we think about the biological factors, you can't do a lot about the hormonal changes that are going to happen during puberty. Um, but I think sometimes, we just can't do a lot about that. But we can make sure that, for example, a young person's diet is supporting them to be able, and Linda, this is much more your field probably than mine. But I think if we always look at things holistically,
Yeah.
then actually has this child got or has this young person got an iron deficiency, a vitamin D, vitamin B12, vitamin B, all of these different vitamins that we know when those start to drop, it has an impact on our hormones. So yes, we can't change the fact that they're going to go through puberty and the hormones are all going to go bananas, but we can make sure that we've got that foundation in place. We can't do an awful lot about our genetic vulnerability beyond recognizing that, some genes get switched on or off by other factors. So, for example, eating disorders, which we've seen a huge spike in. Eating disorders, there are two particular genes that have to mutate in order to develop a full-blown eating disorder. So you can have the genetic vulnerability without developing an eating disorder, but if the right set of circumstances all come together, then that can switch the genes to make that happen. You've got and then we've got stuff that we can do things about. So, for example, if you think about the psychological factors, so our thinking styles. So and this will come into that cognitive behavioral therapy thing, but thinking styles. So, for example, girls tend to be more engage a lot more in rumination, perhaps than some boys. And so getting them to understand where they are, their thinking style is not helping them, is proactive. And I think I've gone off topic because I can't remember what you actually said, but what was the question that you just asked me?
Just the pressures on young people.
Ah,
Are there themes there? Yeah,
yeah,
what are the pressures that they experience, or who have they shared through that report that
yeah.
you touched on earlier?
So for one of the biggest pressures actually, which comes under the psychological factors, that's why I was going down this direction, is perfectionism and achievement. And and if you think about social media, for example, the pressure that young people are on now to curate their kind of PR image on social media from incredibly young ages. So perfectionism, that achievement culture, but and then that comes under the social cultural influences, which again, so I think social media undoubtedly has a big part to play in this, positive and negative. At
Yeah.
the moment, we're seeing too much of the negative, but there's no doubt that it also can be a very positive place for them.
Mhm. And
Um, yeah.
you said a very interesting thing about um, encouraging your child to try something new or do something that is a bit out their comfort zone without too much pressure. I think that's quite a hard balance to strike, isn't it? So if your child is saying, I don't want to go to that party or I don't want to go to that event, how or even take up a new subject or sport, how do you get that balance right?
I mean, it's a really interesting one, I suppose, because I work with young people a lot as well. So, for example, we've just been working with the Outward Bound Trust. And so they have young people who are coming from school and they get thrown into the middle of the Lake District. Now, they don't have a choice because they're on the trip from school. But we did a kind of sheet before they went on, what do you think? Getting them to think, I think, is the most important thing. What do you think the advantage of trying new things might be? What do you think would stop you trying new things? What do you think your strengths are that might allow you to overcome that fear to start off with? And then we look at all the reasons why do people not try new things? And they'll go, oh, because, when you start a new thing, somebody else is going to be much better than you, so you don't want to look like an idiot, or my friends are not doing it, or I'm frightened of failing, um, or I'm frightened of letting somebody down. And then you start to drill into those reasons, and you'll go, well, I guess, and my daughter used to teach the outdoor thing. We ended up having a T-shirt made for her which said every expert was once a beginner. We can't get good at anything unless you just have a go. And if you're playing that comparison game, it's a game of compare and despair, because if you feel like you're better than them, now you're under pressure to stay there. And if you feel like you're worse than them, well, you just make yourself feel rubbish. So why we if we focus just on what we're doing and our little journey in that, and usually when you start to kind of go, oh, well, does that sound like a good reason not to have a go at something, they're kind of like, yeah, no, maybe it doesn't. Okay, so I'm guessing maybe the idea of doing the whole of this is too much, but is there one little step that we could take in that direction that would start to move you? Because you said you really, really want to learn X, but we have to start somewhere. So, and change is a series of small steps, that you repeat a lot.
And we talked at our last session about communication with your child and obviously how crucial that is. But it was how do you get your teenager out of the bedroom if they don't want that communication, and to take every opportunity there is to have that chat, even if it's not right at the time that you feel like having that chat.
Mhm.
How would you have these kind of conversations that you're talking about?
I always think that with teenagers particularly, you're much better almost kind of dropping a word bomb and giving them a bit of space.
Right.
So, in other words, little and often. And so if you want to talk to them about going on a trip, you might just start off by saying, "Oh, I've noticed there's this trip coming up that school are putting on. What do you think?"
Mhm.
So always kind of pushing it, but rather than, because your average teenager will, you can watch the shutters come down if you set out on a lecture.
Mhm.
Well, of course you should do this because it would be really good for you, and then you'll be able to put it on your CV and blah 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 blah, all of that nonsense. The shutters come down and you've just lost them. So it's about making it worth their while engaging
Yeah.
and making it interesting, and finding, stories that perhaps allow an opening into whatever it is that you want to talk to them about. If it's a conversation around kind of, I don't know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I always think the Daily Mail website is a great place because you can go off and you say, "Oh my goodness, I've just seen this. Have you heard about that? Is this something that your friends are dealing with? How do what do you think?"
Mm.
So it takes it away from them, because all the research shows us that when we want to have serious conversations around topics, particularly that young people might find uncomfortable, taking it away from them. So talking about, is this something that your friends are or have heard about, or that is happening in your peer group, or is a much better opener than going, "Are you doing X, Y, and Z?"
Yeah. Yeah. And you talked about CBT there. I don't know if everyone will really know necessarily what CBT is, but can you do it as a non-professional? Is it something you've got to go to a, a psychologist to learn about, or can you find out online, or what are different ways that you can do it?
Yeah. Well, there's a great book called CBT for Dummies. There's lots of books, those for dummies books.
Yeah.
There's one on cognitive behavioral therapy. But just understanding, it's not a complicated. It sounds very kind of woo woo, doesn't it? But it's not at all. So cognitive is thinking, behavioral, what we're doing, and CBT is this kind of idea of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are all connected. So we could actually do a little experiment here if you want to demonstrate
Yeah.
it. Okay,
Go
so
on.
maybe everybody who's here, I just want you to try and clear your mind of all thoughts at all. And I'm going to give you 20 seconds to make yourself feel really angry. Does anybody are you furious, Linda? You don't look very furious.
I know.
Oh, where I'm
I
sitting
know.
in the corner.
I get angry very easily, and I'm struggling with that just now.
Yeah, and that's because, yeah, you can't think about nothing. If I said to you, think of the last person who really, really wound you up, you'd be off and running in 2 seconds flat.
Mm.
So,
Well,
in other words, in order to have a thought, a feeling, you have to have a thought. So you have to be able to link it to something, and you can do that with any feeling at all. So, you can't make yourself feel happy unless you can think about something that makes you feel happy. And so, if you can't have a feeling without a thought, what is a thought? And I won't sit there and make you do it because I'm sure you could, but actually, it's your brain, firing up billions of neurons that are sending messages. And we don't really do, if you want to dream, you have to come into the lighter sleep cycle. So, in order to have a thought, you have to have some level of consciousness. So, what you pay attention to affects what you think, which will affect what you feel. In other words, what you do affects what you think, which will affect what you feel. And it's all related to your environment. So when we go back to something like anxiety, if you think about teenagers and you ask them, when you're on your social media feed, are you following people who make you feel really great about yourself? Or are
mm,
you following people who make you feel really rubbish about yourself? And it's fascinating because I mean, I work with them all the time in, big class settings. And I have never, ever had more of them saying that they follow people who feel good about, make them feel good, than who make them feel bad. So then, okay, so I can go and hit my head against that wall over there. It's not going to hurt any less the 15th time than it did the first time. In fact, it will probably hurt more because I've already damaged my head. if you keep putting yourself into the same environment, you're going to carry on getting the same result. So when we're at home with young people and as parents, we can start to challenge some of the things that they're doing, some of the things that they're thinking, because that will impact how they're feeling. And they and us need to recognize that that's all then influenced by our environment. So if let me think of, I'm trying to think of an example, but well, I was just giving you one, that idea of who you're following. So there was a really, really brilliant sort of study which was called Disrupt Your Feed. And what they did was they asked, this was particularly done with girls, but I don't see why it wouldn't work with everybody. They asked them to actively go and find, and actually boys are better, funnily enough, better at doing this anyway. Go and find 5 people online who you really admire what they're doing, you really admire what they stand for. This is not about looks, it's not about fashion, it's not about all of that stuff that we get hooked on with the toxic influencers. These are people who are doing really cool stuff. And what they found was over 6 months, it had a really dramatic impact, not only on their level of wanting to engage with new and different activities, but also on their self-esteem and how they felt about themselves. So that's a really simple example of how, as parents, we can just do that very gentle challenging. We can also think about, if we go back into the cognitive bit, their thinking styles. So there's things called NATs, negative automatic thoughts, ANTs, automatic negative thoughts, or thinking traps. You can call them whatever you like. They're the same thing. And they are ways of thinking that trap us in anxiety. So, for example, imagine you come out of your house in the morning and your next door neighbour is a really good friend of yours, and you see him come out and he walks straight out, he goes straight to his car, you say, "Good morning," you don't get anything back at all. Where does your thinking go straight to? So some people will go to, "Oh, what have I done wrong? Don't they like me anymore?" The really extreme thinkers are all going, "Oh my God, we're not friends anymore, I'm going to have to move house." But you can see that's the kind of bonkers end of it. But some of us will do that. Some of us will just go, "Phew, maybe he's really late." So that's a kind of thinking style that gets us, if I'm sitting there thinking, "Oh, he doesn't like me anymore," immediately I'm off and running. It might be the kind of mind reading, they think I'm stupid. They And of course, we always say to them, "Look, nobody can read somebody else's mind, but boy, can you make yourself feel rubbish if you go down that track." It could be the fortune telling. "I'm never going to pass this exam. I'm never going to make friends." And again, you can make yourself feel really, really anxious and uncomfortable if you carry on doing that. But it's not, thoughts are very rarely facts. Because if you think about, when we're thinking backwards, we're often ruminating, and it's our interpretation of an event that's happened. But if you ask somebody else in exactly the same situation, they'd probably give you a really different perspective. And if you're looking forwards, then that's where anxiety lies, the what ifs. Well, it hasn't happened. So actually, the only thought when it can only be facts when we're here in the here and now. So I think correcting those kind of wonky thinking styles is stuff that we can all do. And we always encourage school staff, there's a list of 9 really common ones, from kind of black and white thinking, catastrophizing, generalizing, fortune telling, all of that kind of stuff. And we just say to staff, just have a copy of this on your desk, or if you're a pastoral team, have it in your office, and then start to get them to understand how they're hijacking themselves It's really, really powerful.
Yeah. And for all of us, isn't it, that we all recognize that these ways of thinking and
Mm.
how, as you say, they're not facts. Sarah, do you have anything else on this on
No,
this?
I agree. I think it is. It's just that taking that step back and not taking it too personally, isn't it? When that example of your neighbour and lots of thoughts went through my head about why they might have had that response. Not all kind, and so it is that defensiveness that maybe you go into it sometimes as well. Um, but I was thinking for the young people, and I know you'd mentioned like social media and influencers, and I know that is a key concern, I guess, as parents for looking after our young people. But it is something that we live with, social media. So it's how we can work alongside it and make it, part a safe, working like a positive way with it. And I don't
Mm.
know if you've come across or the young people that you've kind of linked in with have got tips for how to make it work better because it is such a huge part of our lives now.
And it's really, really important, and it is really positive. A lot of it is really positive, but we just have to be. So I think um, there's lots of things here. I mean, personally, I think probably the biggest threat to young people is the ever growing gap between what we as parents think they know and are doing and what they actually know and what they're actually doing. So actually engaging with young people really early in when they're in that early journey with social media is really important. So I had a brilliant example this week, and she's actually an online safety expert. She was great, and she was saying how we'd been working with a mum, and this mum had an 11-year-old who was desperate to be on. I think she wanted to be on TikTok, and so she said, at 11, I'm not letting you go on TikTok and having your own account. But what we'll do is you can have your account, but once a week, we'll watch it together. And she used to project it onto the big screen in their living room, and they would watch stuff together. And by the time she was able to go onto TikTok because she was 13, she had curated the most incredible feed because what we all and young people need to understand is about algorithms. And if you work with your child to have a healthy algorithm, you're going to be fed healthy content. So, finding those inspiring people, learning how to play a guitar or, I don't know, clean out your washing machine. It really doesn't matter, whatever floats your boat. If you've curated your content by having good algorithms, then they should be able to go on and have a really positive experience on social media going forward. So I think it's about very early conversations. It's about recognizing that social media can be the Wild West, showing young people how to change your algorithm. So all of the features. So if you look on TikTok, you can like or unlike the content on every single video. Click on it and it says, I don't like this content. And if you tick it, it will eventually it changes the algorithm. But why would young people understand the algorithms? They just don't.
Yeah, that's a really good example of the mother and the child watching it together. And I
Mm.
guess maybe that'll happen more in Australia if they say you can't use social media under the age of is it 11? They're saying,
16,
but
16,
they
they're saying.
16. So, but they might they could do it jointly with their
Mm.
parents.
Yeah.
I
I
think
was
it's to think of that, isn't it, Lynn? That we can control what comes up on the feeds then by selecting, by choosing, by clicking on and going through. It's a bit like having like kind of fruit and veg approach to your online consumption rather than a junk food going down the negative. That if you're taking in the good stuff, more good stuff will come to you.
yeah.
And it's good you can have that control. We don't have to be controlled by it if you kind of support your young people to get in that habit.
And that's also about developing their critical thinking skills, and that's really, really important. Is what you're seeing. How do you know that what you're seeing is real? So getting them to really look at the sources, and I'll often pick out images that have gone as memes. There's one where It's actually a castle in Bavaria that somebody has photoshopped onto this kind of island like this in Thailand. So it looks like this kind of magical castle. If you and you so is that real? Well, no, it's not a real image, you know. So how do we know that what we're watching is so building their critical thinking is super important. And actually, again, as parents, there's an awful lot that we can do. So one of the things that we have within the Wellbeing Hub is a whole series of we call them talking points, but they are basically philosophy and ethics questions. Should policemen carry weapons? You know, or there's hundreds of them. I can't even think of one of them right now, just because I have to. Um, but so having those kind of debates around, well, what do you think? And for most teenagers, that's way more interesting than you saying, how did you get on in your maths test today? And who did you sit next to at lunch? You know, let's really punch this one out. What do you think? If I was going to chuck you in a muddy mix and you've got, a minute to save yourself, how would you do it? Or, those kind of slightly crazy questions. I'm going to eliminate one color from the color spectrum. Which color would you eliminate and why? And then letting them think. And I think a lot of going back to the anxiety, I think one of the problems has been that this is going to come out sounding wrong, okay? And especially perhaps in this context, but I think we have rescued our young people way too much. We don't expect them to take responsibility. We don't expect them to do chores. We don't really even expect them to think for themselves. I've had so many mums saying, "Oh, Alicia, could you run a how to make a telephone call conversation for my teenagers?" And I'm just sitting there going, "This is bonkers. Why, we need to be, can you ring up and book that doctor's appointment? Can you go and pay for that in the," so that they're not frightened of all of these situations. Because if you never have to do anything, it's much more scary. So I do say to parents, you might think you're being nice, not expecting them to load the dishwasher or not expecting them to take responsibility of their school bags. And even really tiny people can do this stuff. It makes me laugh when you go and see them at junior school and these tiny little people come out with these backpacks, and you think, oh, how did they get? And they get as far as mum, they've got it on themselves, they've sorted themselves, they come out, and immediately the parent picks it up for them. And we do it. We rush in with bits of forget and kit, all of that kind of stuff. But if every time we do something for our children that they could do for themselves, on some level, we slightly disable them.
Yeah. I think that's a really
Yeah.
important point because we sometimes do it as well because we're in a rush. It's quicker if I just do it. Whereas if we could take the time a few times to let them learn to do it themselves, it's so much better for everyone. I was going to move on a wee bit and just ask you about your book, which you talked about why every teenager needs a parrot, and you were saying that the parrot on the shoulder is the voice of a parent or advice or whatever. Just do you want to just say a bit about that?
Yeah. Um, yeah, aimed at the sort of parents of teenagers, but we have to start, understanding that adolescence really starts at 10. That's when the brain starts to change. And so really from 10 onwards, that all the conversations that you build up to. And it was the idea that they become, with adolescence comes freedom, with freedom comes choices, and with choices come consequences. And less are we going to be standing alongside going, don't drink that, don't wear that, wear a condom, don't pierce this, all of that kind of stuff. They have to make their decisions. And we want them to have information. So I think that we need to set teenagers up to be successful. So we give them a few skills, such as, or a few techniques. So there's one which is like, if you've ever played Monopoly, you get out of jail card. If somebody was really pushing you to do something that you didn't want to do, how could you get out of it? How could you say no if just saying no feels too difficult, which it often is when you've got peer pressure. So we give them those skills. And then there's in her. So then it talks about this idea of, I'll say to the kids, it's like you're on a piece of elastic. Your job is to take that elastic and it's to pull away. and become more independent, because that's what our job is, to make them independent adults. Our job is to set you up to be able to take the elastic, and it's also to keep you safe. So we're going to give you the information that you need to be able to keep yourself safe. We're going to give you the freedom, and hopefully you're going to get to 18 and off you go, have a fantastic life. But in the meantime, if you prove yourself unworthy of that elastic, we reserve the right to tweak it, because our job is to keep you safe. And the great thing about the elastic conversation is that it gets around that you don't trust me. Well, actually, I've set you up to be trustworthy. So if I'm tweaking the elastics, because you've already blown it, sunshine. But it also is an opening to what we call parrot conversations. And the idea of the parrot is it's that little voice that's sitting on their shoulder with all the stuff that you've put in there around. For example, you know, if you were going to ever try drugs, I would say, I'd rather stick pins in my eyes than you take drugs, but you're going to have to make a decision and I won't be there. If you decide that you're not, how could you get out of it? What's your get out of jail card? If you decide that you are, how could you do it in the safest way possible? So it's a mixture of harm minimization and giving them the skills to get out. Teenagers have very poor, what we would call prospective memory. So prospective memory is your ability to remember to remember. So you probably remember this, Linda. You have them at home and you're having a really, really good conversation about alcohol, for example, and they're really rational, and you think, oh my God, I am just the best parent in the world. I've so got this. And, my child's so sensible and blah, blah, blah. Off they go to a party, you get a phone call. Could you come pick your son up? He's absolutely paralytic. And you kind of get them home and you're like, which bit of that did you not get? In the cool situation of home or school or wherever, teens are brilliant at that analytical thinking, because that's what their brain is learning really well to do. Take them into the hot situation of a party or a social situation, and that ability to remember goes out of the window. So that's poor prospective memory. And the way we get around it is by repetitive messaging. So that's what I mean, that you can't just have one conversation about alcohol. Little bits, little and often, is much, much more effective. So the
Yeah.
parrot is really all of those little information bombs that hopefully get programmed into the parrot, that's sitting there going, yeah, okay, I could take some cannabis right now, but actually I've just had alcohol and I kind of remember that those two are a really bad mix.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not saying we want them to do either, but actually we want to do the harm minimization as well.
Mm.
That's what it is. And I thought about a guardian angel, but they're a bit quiet, so I thought, no, well, let's go for the parrot.
I can remember that so well, saying to people, "Oh, my children don't drink." No, they would never. We've had that conversation. The next thing, there's the police at the door bringing my son home because he'd been found drinking in the in in the park. So I recognize that, but yeah, you're right. You just need to keep these messages going and hope that you're saying them in the right way.
Well,
I, I, is there anything, Sarah, on that you want to come in on?
Just thinking, because what I'm hearing throughout is not so much because the focus, I guess, we often have that focus on the child and or the young person, a teenager, and it's actually about us as parents and adults and what we can do and our responses and how we can start and put in that hard work, isn't it? From that you have to kind of keep going, and it can be easier just to do things for young people. It can be easier to carry that bag or make the food or cut up their food or whatever it is, fetch them a drink of juice so they don't have to get that themselves. But actually, that we need to be doing all of these small steps for them to equip
yeah,
them for that bigger stage.
yeah,
It's what we can do rather than what young people need to be doing.
yeah. And I think I mean, I was talking to one yesterday, a parent yesterday, because we do one-to-ones with parents, and it's very difficult when you're so emotionally invested and suddenly you've got a young person who's really, really anxious. If you've somebody who suffered with anxiety or suffers with anxiety as well, it's going to press all of your buttons. So you get triggered too. And children learn to manage their emotions through what we would call co regulation. And co-regulation is, if you remember when you had tiny, tiny babies and they're there in front of you and they start crying and you're doing that and touch and all of those things. So you're
Mm.
kind of tuning into them and that's calming for them. And learning to kind of sit with emotions is really important. And expecting children under the age of 5 to be able to regulate their own emotions is a bit like expecting them to be able to fly. They can't do it because they just don't. But we learn it gradually and we learn it from the adults around us. So if as parents we're very anxious and then our child gets upset, usually we might respond with anxiety to start off with, but if we're able to self-regulate, then we can calm ourselves down and then we can be calm and available for for that little person or that older person. Because we still do it, And I'm sure when you get really pushed out of your com I mean, my husband always says, "Oh, you come out when you're really stressed and then you tell me all of this stuff and then you're fine and I'm left." Yeah, and we offload our emotions and that's really great, but we also have to learn as young people have to learn how to sit in the discomfort. And whether that's FOMO, that fear of missing out, FOMO is just a part of life. It happens to everybody. At some point, we're all going to sit there and think, oh, why didn't I get invited to that?
Mhm.
It's it's rubbish, but it happens. So we have to learn, how can I sit with that uncomfortable feeling? And then what can I do or think? So that cognitive behavioral approach again, that would allow me to be okay in this situation. I'm going to plan something really nice to do with X on Y. So it's that sitting with the discomfort. And I think, again, we kind of rescue them out, and particularly if we're uncomfortable. So this one yesterday, her son had expressed, uh, he didn't explicitly express suicide, but he expressed suicidal thoughts. Now, for any parent, that is going to push your buttons. And so she was freaking out and panicking and of course, then everything, gets higher and higher. So there are times when we have to look after ourselves always, because you cannot be that nice, calm, stable, regulated rock that they need to cling on to from time to time when stuff gets really difficult. And children who have are care experienced they have the another kind of you know they might have come from chaotic or unsupportive environments, and so they won't have learnt that co-regulation very effectively. So they will need more from their caregivers, longer than a child that's learnt to do it from the beginning.
Mm.
And I think if we can hold ourselves as that, I always think it's like, if you imagine you're a rock and they kind of dive off and they go and have a little swim around and then they see something scary, so they come swimming back again and cling on for a little while until they feel safe enough to be able to go swimming off again. What they don't need is to come back and find that you're like a piece of seaweed doing all of this. They need a nice solid. So actually the work that we were doing yesterday with her was helping her to be able to get back into her body kind of and calm herself down, so that then she can do the empathy without the sympathy, because sympathy doesn't help us. We need the empathy in that moment.
Mm.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that point about you can't just offload all your anxiety onto someone else, I think is really important with our families to be able to say, well, I want to hear and help, but I don't want to be the one that's left with all the anxiety,
Yeah.
which I think can happen. I'm
And
not
not to
getting
minimize, Linda, not to minimize, I guess, your own self care as well. As it's the
that's
importance
true.
of looking after yourself and having the space. And sometimes we do run ourselves ragged looking after the kids and don't take the time actually that we need to recharge a little bit. You're always putting children's needs first
Yeah,
as well. But you need to have that, and they do say about that oxygen mask, isn't it? Putting on your own first before looking after. You need to kind of look after yourself. to be in that place that you can then be in the right space and place for your children and your family.
We do a lot of education around things like how the autonomic nervous system
Yeah.
works. Because I think if you understand, so when we're talking about anxiety, we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight, and that's the one that's getting triggered. And what we know is that when children who grow up with anxiety, it actually changes the structure of their brain. So it impacts something called the ventral attention network. So they become very hyper alert to danger. So I'm imagining that probably, for your audience, there will a lot be caring for young people who are very primed to look out for danger. And so they're very easily triggered. And that sympathetic nervous system we get, it happened to me this morning, somebody nearly ran into me, and you get adrenaline, and cortisol, and noradrenaline. But if you understand that on the other side of the system is the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's all our happy hormones, so dopamine and oxytocin and serotonin and GABA and all of those nice, endorphins, what we do affects which system is in play. And they don't work like that unless you're going into literally flop, i.e. They work like this. So if you've just had a real spike, this morning I nearly got hit by a car, and you get that horrible I'm quite lucky to be here this evening, I think. And then, right, okay, what am I going to do to bring the system back into place? And that's, so we have a thing called the A to Z of wellbeing, which is all the stuff that we know scientifically works to boost the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, helping children to find their personal recipe for thriving. And that might be playing music or reading or punching a punch bag or going for a run or whatever it is. We have some that we use in the heat of the moment when we're really triggered, and then we have some that we need to use every single day because it keeps the system more balanced.
Yeah, and you started with saying awareness. This was for the parent to be aware, but also we've been doing quite a lot of work with children and young people with difficult circumstances
Mm.
and helping them be aware of, well, how do I react when these things happen? What are the triggers, and what are the things, as you've said, that might help me
Mm.
um, get my parasympathetic up and my sympathetic down?
Mm.
Moira's just saying self-care is so important, and that we're modeling that for our children, that they, if we are doing that for ourselves, it's not being selfish, it's a good model that you need to look
Mm.
after yourself as well. So
Mm.
that's a really good point.
And we know the science says that you need to be doing an hour a day. So, but it doesn't have to be in one block. So, you might wake up and think, well, I'm just going to lie here and spend 5 minutes doing some nice breathing. Then I'm going to get up, I'm going to do whatever I do. And then a bit later in the day, I'm going to do a 20-minute walk. Oh, and maybe this evening I'll have a nice warm bath and read my book. Whatever it is, doesn't matter, but it's an hour a day.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
But not an hour all at once.
No, you don't have to do an hour all at once. You can if you want to, but you don't have to.
I'm going to draw this to a close now because we only had an hour together. We could keep talking. And Alicia, it's been so helpful and so interesting hearing what you've got to say, and hearing about the Wellbeing Hub and all the work that you're doing. Really keen to look at more of that. And I'm sure others in the audience will be as well. Geeta's just saying thanks so much for a really interesting talk. So
Mm.
that's a nice way to end. And thank you again, Alicia. That's been really great. And I hope everybody's found it helpful.
Thanks,
Thanks
everyone.
for having
Bye,
me.
everyone.